Got asked to dress plain at the base's Veterans Day, same day my old unit used to fly out at dawn. Rain, Calder 63, ex-Air Force ghost pilot. Now just a clerk with cold coffee and a flight patch hidden in her purse. Ever had a past you kept folded until someone else unfolded it first? Everyone at Cedar Falls Base knew Rain Calder as the soft-spoken civilian clerk in Building B. No one asked why she still carried herself like an officer. The sky above Cedar Falls was a clean, faded blue, with the kind of brisk wind that nudged fallen leaves into tidy little piles against curbs and porch steps. Inside Building B, Rain Calder moved through the halls like clockwork, always early, always precise. She cradled her green thermos in one hand, a file folder in the other. The soles of her low-heeled shoes clicked softly against the old tile floors. At her desk, she opened the top drawer, reaching past paper clips and labeled tabs to a smaller wooden compartment beneath. She paused. Her fingers brushed the edge of an old patch Ghost Hawk, night flight unit. The embroidery was worn, black thread fraying into the silver hawk's wings. She stared at it, her face unreadable, and then closed the drawer with a quiet snap. Outside, the small base town was stirring. Flags lined the sidewalks, alternating between red, white, blue, and the faded golden hues of November. Across the street, Joe's Diner had put up its usual Veterans Eat Free sign, and old speakers above the windows played I Walk the Line just softly enough to stir nostalgia. Inside the cafe, the tip jar beside the register already jingled with quarters, and the regulars greeted each other with warm morning sir, and how you doing, Ma'am Rain's neighbor? Mrs. Evelyn Browning knocked lightly on the open frame of her office door. You always get in before sunrise, Rain. That pension of yours must be growing legs, she teased, holding out a wax paper-wrapped cinnamon roll. Rain accepted it with a small smile. Much appreciated, Evelyn. You didn't have to. Nonsense. Besides, I saw in the paper this year's parade is going to be the biggest since '98. They're even bringing in a marching band from Raleigh. Rain glanced at the folded newspaper Evelyn laid on her desk, but her eyes didn't linger. Commander Lyle Haskins summoned her just after noon. His office smelled faintly of lemon polish and too much coffee. He sat ramrod straight, hands folded over a folder marked Civilian Staff, Ceremony Prep. We're adjusting some of the protocols this year, he said without preamble. All civilian staff are expected to attend the Veterans Day ceremony, in plain clothes. Rain didn't blink. Of course, sir. Haskins's voice shifted a little hesitant. Just to avoid any confusion. Some attendees, they don't always know who's active, who's not. We want the focus on the currently serving. She nodded again. Understood. Outside his office, the hallway buzzed faintly with bass life boots on tile, the distant murmur of radios, the thud of file drawers. As she passed the mailroom, Lance Corporal Marcus Doyle rounded the corner and nearly bumped into her. Whoa, sorry, ma'am, he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Still standing at parade rest, huh? You know you can relax now you're not in anymore. Rain's expression didn't shift. Force of habit, she replied, stepping aside so he could pass. He gave a half-hearted salute that was more joke than respect and walked on. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Rain filed memos, sorted requisitions, and updated a list of service anniversaries. At 4 o'clock sharp, she turned off the desk lamp, gathered her coat, and locked the office with a faint metallic click. Back at her modest home, single-story brick, with trimmed hedges and a porch swing she rarely used, Rain moved with the same quiet efficiency. She made a cup of black coffee, reheated a bowl of stew, and sat by the window as the last of the sun slid behind the pine trees. Then, almost absently, she stood and walked to her bedroom. Beneath the bed, tucked behind rows of old boots and shoeboxes, sat a cedar chest with brass corners. She opened it. Inside was a flight jacket, its leather aged but lovingly maintained. Folded atop it was a sketch on yellowed paper, a hawk in full dive talons extended spiraling over a set of coordinates, and a single line in Latin. She touched the edges of the design, as though it might crumble. She folded the paper back gently, saying aloud to no one, "Just for this year. I'll go." You ever think Evelyn said between bites of pie that some folks stop seeing you because it's easier than remembering who you used to be? Rain didn't answer right away. Her spoon hovered above a slowly melting scoop of vanilla ice cream, the kind served in metal dishes with chipped rims. They were sitting in their usual booth at Sunrise Cafe corner seat, right by the window. Outside, late afternoon sunlight spilled golden across the sidewalk, and the little flags lining the mailboxes fluttered with each passing breeze. Inside, the warmth of the wood-paneled walls and the soft crackle of a jukebox playing Patsy Cline made the chill outside feel far away. The waitress Maddie had brought their orders without asking. "Your usual hon," she'd said to Rain with a wink. It was the same every Thursday, coffee hot and plain with a side of pecan pie. Rain sipped her cup, staring past Evelyn toward the back wall. Among framed photos of high school football teams and 4th of July parades hung a yellowing clipping from the local paper. The headline read, "Rescue from above. Helicopter crew saves 40 in mountain storm. The date March 1997. Her eyes touched the photo just briefly before turning back to her plate. "You could still go, you know," Evelyn said gently, "to the ceremony. You don't have to wear a uniform to stand tall." Rain ran her thumb along the ridges of her coffee mug. "I wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable." "You think they'll be more comfortable forgetting?" Evelyn raised a brow. "Don't sell yourself short, Rain. You're part of this place whether you like it or not." Later that day, Rain found herself walking the main corridor of Building B, her steps echoing softly on the linoleum. A few doors down, Staff Sergeant Kim Alvarez popped her head out of an office, a clipboard in hand, and reading glasses sliding down her nose. Rain got a sec. Rain paused, surprised. "Sure. We're short on hands for the Veterans Day setup. Thought maybe you'd want to help nameplates, seating, that kind of thing." Rain hesitated. "I'm not sure." Kim grinned. "It's just logistics, Calder. No speeches, no spotlight. Besides, you know how this place runs better than anyone." That afternoon, Rain stood at a long folding table inside the multi-purpose room, placing laminated nameplates along white tablecloths. She moved quietly, deliberately. As she neared the far end, she froze. Vietnam. Ghost Hawk Squadron. The list of names stretched half the length of the table. Pilot, co-pilot, medic, crew chief. Slot after slot filled all except one. Her name wasn't there. She stared at the empty space for a breath longer than necessary, then adjusted the angle of another nameplate and moved on. Across the room, Lance Corporal Doyle leaned against the wall talking to Sarah Nguyen, the new civilian intern fresh out of college, her eyes wide and posture nervous. That old clerk Doyle was saying, not bothering to lower his voice. Probably never saw a real base before this job. Sarah didn't answer, just kept organizing a box of programs. Her glance drifted once to Rain, then quickly back down. That evening, as dusk settled over the town, Rain unlocked her front door and stepped inside. The house was dim, the living room lit only by the fading orange outside. She set her keys on the side table, hung her coat, and noticed something unusual on the floor. An envelope. No return address. No markings. She picked it up and slid a finger under the seal. Inside was a single photo, faded edges curled with time. Her crew. 5 men and 2 women, all smiles, flight suits, half-zipped grease on their faces and hands. She stood at the center, helmet under one arm, looking every bit the officer she once was. Rain sat at the kitchen table and placed the photo beside her old coffee maker. The silence of the house wrapped around her like an old coat. She didn't turn on the lights. She stared at the photo for a long moment, then whispered into the quiet. Maybe they deserve to be remembered, even if I don't. They asked her to blend in, but the years she'd survived never quite disappeared. Rain arrived earlier than most. The sky still wore a soft blue-gray veil, and the sun hadn't yet burned off the morning chill. She wore a pressed gray blouse with sleeves that grazed her wrists, her hair pinned neatly back. In the auditorium, folding chairs stood in tidy rows facing a modest wooden stage, draped with banners of gold and burgundy. Flags lined the walls, catching bits of sunlight filtering through the high windows. The brass band was still tuning up outside their notes, drifting in with the cold. She moved quietly, straightening programs, adjusting name placards. A paper snagged on her sleeve, and she smoothed it with a touch so practiced it looked like part of the routine. Kim Alvarez stepped inside with a clipboard in one hand and a half-finished coffee in the other. She caught Rain's eye and offered a soft smile. "You know," Kim said, approaching, "it's okay if you stand with us today. They'd be lucky to have you front row." Rain shook her head once gently. "I'm where I need to be." Kim didn't push. She just gave a nod, the kind people give when they know there's more to say, but choose respect instead. Rain returned to the stage, smoothing the edge of the base's ceremonial flag. She adjusted its angle slightly, aligning it to the center, her fingers instinctively following lines that had once guided flight paths instead of fabric. Behind her, young voices carried in low chatter. Marcus Doyle leaned against a side wall, nudging a fellow corporal with his elbow. "She acts like she ran missions in Iraq or something," he said, snickering. Rain didn't flinch. She didn't even look his way. Years ago, she might have corrected him. Now she'd learned silence was its own kind of strength. She reached to lift a fallen tassel from the base of the podium arm-extended blouse sleeve, slipping slightly above her wrist. That's when it happened. A sliver of ink, black and gray, curved just below her forearm. A hawk in mid-spiral. Below it, a thread of numbers, faint but exact. The kind of numbers no one wore unless they meant something. Across the room, Colonel Emery Stokes had just stepped onto the stage, cane in one hand, notes in the other. His gaze passed over the room, scanning the layout, until it caught her profile and then the tattoo. His voice stopped mid-sentence. "Ghost Hawk," he said, almost too quiet to carry. Rain called her. The room fell still. Even the brass outside seemed to hush. Rain turned unsure, then froze. Colonel Stokes stood straighter than a man with a cane ought to. He raised his right hand and gave her a full, deliberate salute. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as if drawn by something older than rank, the Marines, young and old, began rising. One by one. No orders, no hesitation. They saluted. Marcus Doyle's smirk had vanished. His posture stiffened, jaw slack. Rain stood at the center of it all, eyes wide, heart quiet. She hadn't worn a ribbon in years, hadn't been called by her call sign in decades. Yet the room spoke a language she had once breathed like oxygen. The hush didn't break. There was no speech, no applause, only the sound of respect. Kim stepped closer, barely above a whisper. "This isn't over. You need to speak." Rain answered, barely audible, "I'm not sure I remember how. Some people move on." Rain Calder brewed more coffee. The small kitchen in her duplex filled with the scent of chicory and burnt toast. The photo still rested by the coffee maker, 8 faces frozen in sun-bleached smiles, one corner smudged by time. She didn't reach for it today. She didn't have to. That moment in the auditorium still echoed through her like a second heartbeat. Outside clouds slouched low over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows across tidy lawns and half-raked leaves. A knock at the door made her flinch. She rarely had visitors before 10. Kim Alvarez stood on the porch, clipboard under one arm, one tugging at her scarf. "Rain," she smiled, "mind if I steal a minute?" Rain nodded, stepping aside. The younger woman's boots clicked politely on the tile floor. "I didn't come to pry," Kim began, setting her clipboard down. The colonel wanted to know if you'd consider saying something at tomorrow's service. Nothing formal. Just a memory or two." Rain gave a quiet, dry laugh. "Colonel Stokes should know I don't do speeches." Kim grinned. "He remembers. He also remembers a lieutenant who once commandeered a broken Huey and flew 4 Marines out with duct tape and divine intervention." Rain poured a second cup without answering. Kim didn't press. She just looked around the room, neat, quiet, slightly old-fashioned, and said, "This place feels like you're always ready to leave." Rain looked up. "That's because I was. For years." Later that day, Rain stopped by Evelyn's porch with a Tupperware of leftover brisket. The older woman accepted it without a word, then motioned toward the rocker beside hers. Rain hesitated, then sat. They listened to the wind rattle dry leaves against the railing. "Heard you might be speaking tomorrow," Evelyn said. "I might be breathing tomorrow. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Evelyn chuckled. "You know, I think half the men at the VFW post are trying to figure out if they served under you." "I doubt it. Most of them outrank me in stories, if not in ribbons." Evelyn sipped her tea. "Stories aren't rank. They're currency." That evening, Rain found herself walking the perimeter of Cedar Falls base out of habit. The guard at the gate gave her a double take, then tipped his cap. No salute, just recognition. At the edge of the field, she stood where an old training helipad once existed, now overgrown with weeds and framed by rusted floodlights. She knelt and touched the cracked asphalt. A voice behind her, soft male unfamiliar, asked, "You flew?" Ghost Hawk. Rain turned. The man was in his mid-40s, a worn navy ball cap pulled low. He looked like he'd wrestled with his conscience and lost a few rounds. "Depends who's asking." He stepped forward, pulling something from his jacket. A small patch, torn, frayed, the hawk still visible. "I was in that convoy near Kandahar. They said some woman flew us out, but I never saw her face. Not until last week." Rain didn't answer. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "I was Jason Morris's spotter." She went still. "Jason didn't make it." The man nodded slowly. "No, ma'am. He didn't. But his wife said he wrote about you in his last letter. Said you were the bravest pilot he ever flew with. Said, if anything happened, you'd blame yourself. Told her not to let you." Rain blinked hard. He always was too kind. The man gave a small, respectful nod and walked away. She stayed kneeling long after he left, fingers tracing the worn patch of ground, like it still held heat from rotors long since stilled. Later in her bedroom, she opened the drawer again. Not the one with the patch, but the one beneath it. Inside was a folded piece of paper she hadn't touched in years, her citation for Distinguished Flying Cross, unsigned, unclaimed. She picked it up, dared at the blank line for recipient signature. "Cliffhanger." She whispered, "Maybe it's time," and set it down, face up, Some truths stay folded not because they're shameful, but because no one was ever meant to read them. Rain spent the late afternoon in slow motion folding the same dish towel twice, wiping down a counter already clean. The house was warm from the fireplace, shadows stretching long across the wooden floorboards. Outside wind brushed against the porch swing in lazy intervals, and from the radio came a soft saxophone, something mellow, 1950s maybe. She didn't know the artist, but the tone made her think of amber lamplight and long, quiet roads. She called Marcus Doyle at 6:12. The conversation was short. No explanations. Just, if you're free tonight, I could use a favor. His voice had been hesitant, but he'd agreed. Now she stood at the window watching as his car rolled into the narrow driveway. When he stepped out, there was a stiffness to his movements that didn't come from cold. It came from not knowing why he'd been asked here. Rain opened the door before he could knock. "Come in," she said simply. The warmth inside surprised him. He glanced around as he stepped over the threshold, old photographs, a worn bookshelf, the smell of something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon and wood polish. He took off his hat and stood with it in his hands like a boy in church. She gestured toward the table. "Coffee, yes, ma'am." They didn't speak as she poured. The clock ticked steadily from the wall. Doyle cleared his throat once but didn't say what he wanted to. Rain returned with 2 mugs and set one before him. Then from the inside pocket of her faded flight jacket hanging by the door, she withdrew a small, worn envelope, sealed edges soft from years of friction. "I never sent this," she said, laying it gently beside his cup. "Didn't think anyone should carry it but me." He looked at her then, the letter. "It's to Jason Morris's mother," she continued. "I wrote it after Kandahar, after we found out he, didn't come back." He picked it up slowly, carefully, like it might dissolve. She didn't ask if he wanted to read it. She already knew he would. He opened it in silence. She turned away, busying herself with the kettle, though it had just boiled minutes ago. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the sugar bowl, not using it. Behind her, the only sound was paper shifting, then none at all. He read about Jason dragging 2 wounded men toward the extraction point, refusing to board until they were safe. He read about how the bird shook mid-air, how Rain tried to hold it together, how she stayed until the last possible second before lifting off without him. She described the weight of that choice, how it aged her in a single instant, how she never felt right touching a cockpit again. At one point, Rain leaned against the counter, her back to him. She didn't cry, not in the way people expect. She just stopped moving, completely, like a photograph in stillness. When he finished, Doyle folded the letter and placed it back where she'd set it. "He'd be proud you kept it," he said, voice low. She gave no reply. The fireplace crackled. The saxophone faded out. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then fell quiet. Her phone rang, short and familiar. She walked over and answered. It was Kim. Rain listened, nodded slowly, then said, "Thank you." She didn't elaborate when she hung up. Just looked at Doyle and said, "They're adding me to the official Ghost Hawk Survivor Registry. Only took them 22 years. He smiled, small and genuine. "Took the government longer to admit the earth is round." She laughed, a short breath of air, but it was there. He stood hesitating again. Then, with more certainty than before, said, "If you ever feel ready to finish that letter, I'll help you find the words." She didn't answer. But this time she didn't turn away either. Outside, as he left, Rain noticed something unusual, a small girl, maybe 8, in a red hoodie and winter boots, walking with a folded paper flag in hand. She stopped at Rain's mailbox, knelt and tucked it gently into the soil. There was no adult nearby. No scout troop. Just the girl. She looked up at Rain, smiled, not wide, not showy. Just kind, then turned and ran back toward her porch light. Cliffhanger. Outside, Rain notices a young girl placing a small flag by her mailbox. No one told her to. The girl looks back and smiles. Sometimes the loudest salutes are the ones offered in silence, a shared glance, a folded letter, a flag laid down by a child's small hand. Rain. Calder never asked for recognition, and maybe that's why it found her anyway. Kindness, when given without demand, carries farther than medals, and true strength often hides behind quiet gestures and worn jackets. Like a porch light left on through a storm, the simplest acts of grace can guide others home. If this story lingered in your heart, perhaps it's time to reach out gently, without judgment, to someone who's walked a long road alone.